There is a right way and a wrong way to teach restorationism. What is restorationism? It is the view that God is restoring to the church what has been lost. And there are many versions of this. We're looking in particular at George Warnock's 1951 book, The Feast of Tabernacles, and the version of restoration that he teaches in that book. Now, Warnock teaches that there are parallels between the history of Israel and the history of the church. So we have King David as an anointed, and he has the glorious early days of his reign. Obviously, that compares with the early church and the day of Pentecost and the glory of the early church. Then we have Solomon and his corruption, compromise. And in church history, we have the Emperor Constantine and the compromises and the worldliness that he brought into the church. And then you have Israel going into captivity in Babylon. Well, and that was the Babylonian captivity, which for the church lasted, as far as Warnock is concerned, 10 centuries until Luther came and ended the Babylonian captivity of the church, just as Israel of the Old Testament came out of Babylon and with Nehemiah began to restore the foundations and build up the walls and seek the restoration of the church, as did the Protestantism. But by the time Christ came to Israel, the religious system was corrupt. And then the leaders of that system tried to kill Jesus. Now, this is what Warnock compares with the Protestantism of his day. And he goes on to say that they were corrupt and desolate. And finally, he compares the ministry of Jesus to Israel with the revival that was happening in his own day. And he says, with the appearing of Christ in Israel, a new temple was brought into being by the incarnation. So now Protestantism has been left desolate because of her disobedience, and a new temple is being born by the Spirit of God, even the temple of the living God, the body of Christ. By the way, I am a restorationist in the sense that I do believe God is restoring things to the church, and in a few minutes I will tell you what I believe is the most important thing that God is and has restored to the church. But first, what I find difficult about Warnock's view. First of all, the broad brush with which he paints church history. It's a very broad brush, and it gets broader and broader as he goes through history, and the enormous gaps in history where he deals with a few parallels, and they are compelling parallels with church history and the history of Israel, but then he skips centuries as if it's flyover country, as if there's generations of Christians from whom we have nothing to learn, have nothing to teach us. But we focus on a few things where we can see some striking parallels, a few major events. And of course, he was living through one of those. In his view, he was living through one of the great events of church history. He wrote this book in 1951 in the midst of a revival of which he was a part, and it was a major revival, the Latter Rain movement. He was writing from northern Canada where it had its beginnings, the revival that birthed the movement. And it was a great revival, but this is the wrong way to teach restorationism. It's a very negative view of church history, and it comes through in these other quotes from his book. For example, from chapter 10, the history of the church is a history of darkness and sorrow and bitterness. And from chapter 7, however, we are not going to take the history of the church as our pattern, for it is a sad story of defeat and worthy of far more lamentation than the weeping prophet ever expressed over Israel. Now, there is a lot of evil in church history. There's no doubt about that, but that's not the whole story. There's a lot of good things also in church history, a lot of great examples. And Warnock was writing, like I said, from a great revival. I do detect in his book revival prejudice, and that happens when you're in the midst of a great move of God and you think no one has experienced this before, and this is what everyone is missing in the church in the rest of the world. Also, Warnock was not a historian. He was not writing a history book. He cannot be expected to know all the details of church history. The parallels he draws are compelling, especially in the early parts of this parallels with David and Constantine and Solomon and all of that. And I do believe there are many, many more parallels between church history and the history of Israel, more that we have yet to discover. That's why we should study history more, not dismiss it as flyover country the way that Warnock does. So that is the wrong way to teach restorationism. And as I said, he wasn't a historian. He can be excused for what he did not know. The problem is that he did not care He was not interested in learning, and he thought that there was actually nothing to learn from church history except what he already knew. Two men that are often given as examples of restoration in the church are Martin Luther and John Wesley. And one thing they had in common, they were vigorous students of church history. They had studied the writings of the ancient church fathers. They understood the road that led from the first century to their day. They had inhabited the thought world of previous generations. And then, and only then, did they try to restore what they thought was lost. Another lesson I can take from Luther and Wesley is that restoration is not a straight line. It's not like adding a brick upon a brick. It's more like a lot of destruction and rebuilding, and it's not a straight line. There's a lot of zigs and zags. There is triangulation. There's what Bill Jackson called the quest for the radical middle. It's a messy process, in other words, not a straight line. All the more reason to study church history and love church history. These are our family members that we're studying. Now, I said that I would share with you what I believe is the most important thing God has restored to the church and is restoring still, and that is this: traction. And let me explain why I think that. You take any other spiritual gift, spiritual ministry, biblical doctrine, biblical practice of the church that you believe needs to be restored or has been restored. If you look in the past and if you search church history hard enough, I believe you will find that it was restored, but then lost again. And it probably, maybe more than once, it was restored in a location for a generation or two, but it was forgotten again. And why? Because it did not gain traction. Here's a strength of Warnock's view. He believes in the first century church there was a sense of trajectory, that the church was on a path. And that sense of trajectory was lost and restored, and I like that view, and I agree with that. Now, if these things interest you, studying the Bible, studying church history, seeking the presence of Jesus in a greater way for his church to walk in victory, then subscribe to the channel.